dziko ilili Mungu anagamba kuti mpungwe wawo ukhuza maiko ena, USA, United States of America, ukhuza maiko ena. Pakali pano zinthu zikusokonekera chifukwa zakhuza zakugwira ngakhale kuchuma. Anagamba za USA, anagamba za China, anagamba za Russia. Yes, zakhuza kuchuma andi kulimikangano yaikulu kwambiri kumene kuja ndiye zakhuza maiko ambiri. So zikapitirira zimenezi sizikhala bwinowani, zisokonekera zinthu. America achite changu chapambuye. America achite changu chapambuye. Achite changu kwa china chake akufunika andithandize ndithu, andithandize kuwerenga pa Daniel 2. Afunika andithandize kuyambira Daniel 2 mpaka pomalizira. Andithandize kuwerenga ma America andithandize kuwerenga chifukwa akufunika Mulungu mofulumira china chake chichitika. Mulungu awathandize fa zambiri zisala zikazonongeka, chuma chonuka chambiri. So afunika kupemphera pakati pa nkhondo zawo za ndalama yawo iyi ya dola ndi ndalama ina ya ukoko. So China, Mulungu anagamba China kangapo, China samale kangapo. Afune asafune ziwafika pa khosi kwambiri nkhani ya democracy. Iwafika pa khosi kwambiri. Paka Mulungu anati China asamale pambali pa mpungwe wake umene ulipo mkati mpakati pa iye ndi USA ndi Russia. Pasina zake zimene zikuzungulira nkhani ya ukulu. Kuli ukulu mkati pansi pakepa pali ukulu pansipa. Ndipacho kanithandize kuwerenga Daniel 2. China, Russia atapanga kampeni ya ikulu maiko kaoka ndikulowa kwambiri maiko siyana dziko lapansi, ndikuyamba kuthandiza maiko a dziko lapansi mochuluka koma osawauza kuti azipereka kanthu. Ndiye ndikuona pali nkhondo pakati pa osati nkhondo ya kumenyana, nkhondo ya kuserika pakati pa America, UK kulimbana. Of course nazi protokoza kale zinthusi anayamba kale kulimbana kuserika, panopa kulimbana za ndalama, panopa kulimbana za mdibidi. Ndiye ndikuona koma kulimbana konena kuti maiko awandi athu. Ndikuona anthu awawo atakula mphamvu koma chikungofunika tipemphere chifukwa maiko wa China, Russia akakula mphamvu. Chida chikencho nena kuti maiko onse amene atichitidwe kava ndiwowa ulamuliro kokhala wakhaza azipanga zimene atafune ali kuchosedwa pa kuti khala kovuta. Vuto lili pati America, UK democracy yawo ili ndi vuto. Democracy imene kuendera lero ili ndi mavuto ndio nena kuti ndalama zawo akapeleka zili ndi malamulo. Awa zawo zizikhazo pana malamulo. Awa zili ndi malamulo. Ngati mukufuna ndalama imo mutikupasani koma mpange 1 2 3 ndi zambiri zochuka zimene zikuchitika mabungu amene. Ena ni mabungu amene mumamva azaufulu anthu ndi akuyisa ntchito mola kuika sandekeza kulowa momwemo. Ena ukwatena akazi okauka muna okauka zikulowa momwemo. Mu democracy momwemo. Koma mbali ina yake iliko ndi ubwino mumasankha amene mukumutalinu mukumufuna. Imafika siku limene mumasankha amene mukumufuna. Pamene awa chimene chikubwera kwawo chilibe zimenezo. Chabwino ndi chiti anthu apange chani. Yes, tingobwerera tibwerere tikawerenge ku Daniel 2 kuyambira pa 1 kulekeza pa 48 pachamaso Kenya amfumu Nebukadneza anaona chumba chifano ndichinali ndi makala zosiyana koma pakali pano tili kumapazi kama ndiwerengera zimenezo sikulina ino amene kuchonera. Ndikuona maiko mpungwe wa ukulu kwambiri mpungo menewu ukukula hivi mpaka pano kuchitika chakula tangu zake za mwezi ziliko mkati msipenda akufuna wina akaende ma weakness kapena kusofoka ndiye kukutumizidwa ndrama yosokonezera chimene mkuchiti timukasana sona hapa ndikona mipungo itakula kwa miti imene nakamba so nene wina maomba maiko osati so chita so kuwerenga kuti koma kuje pakala kuguruzika kwa miti kwa ndrama imene kuchoka uthambi za demokrasi kati kuli ndrama ya malamulo ndiye kumatumizira wena muzina la ufulu wantu oyang'anira zaza kuti ani kusozimana na pasiva zina zanga tiziza nukwati anokao kazi ziliko koma kuzipanga mozema kumapanga ma meeting pena ndipena nkali malawi momo koma akupanga mobisa so ndikuona mpungo utakula kwa miti kuto likubwera lochu tisisa kwa mbili kuna kuchika ngati ndi chizolo wezi ziko lapa sili makala choncho nimeza kalile Chambuzi Mungu akuti tifunga kutapokana chifukwa zichuluka China tipembeze chifukwa cha America China ndi maiko zungu ya Britain ndi Russia mkangano wa America ndi China ukula kwambiri kondo yaoi yukoza kufika pa mlingoso kwa zikula masi tikwenda kupempera anthu awo ndi chani chimene akulimbanirana afuna chani chifuna kuchitika chani awawa tifuna tiwaikeze manyomo ma president nyumba zao zikudwa ni mavuto mabanja hawa kudwa ni mavuto zipani zikudwa ni mavuto mikangano ikula kochuka mipatuko ya mikangano muzipani ichiukisisa akuti nkhondo chimene sana kulokoleko akuti nkhondo zeni wakati nkhondo zimene amanena za America ndi China ndi Britain ndi Russia zimene pano zakula nsingu iya nkhondo zeni zibuka chifukwa kuti tikuoneka ngati tikufuna tioneke ngati ndi nzeru ndiye akuti ndibwereze nzeru za tizitani mveo amuna kutase sinati nkondwa yakwayambika ma America ndi ndiyazo zinthu chimene tikuona patsogolo pako ndi mavuto ndiye akumbukire zimene Mulungu amakamba za China Russia kuphatikizika ndi maiko ena Irani momwemo Mulungu amanena kuti kodi vuto ndi demokrasi ya America kapena Chinese awa ndi Russia chipanu zlawa kungopeleka zilibe malamulo ayikwati zili malamulo ndiye kapena ndiye vuto ndiye Mulungu ati vuto ndio nakuti mu demokrasi muli tiyapasa ndalama zikwatirana zipangani koma mbali ina ili bino ukupwa Yesu amene zambirwa ndi awa bali kapena ndazazo sawa azingolamulia kumambo pita ili kakati demokrasi iliko kuma bali kapena akangolowa walowayo azingotanda mene azingopita ndiye tu Afghanistan ndiye aloseli Russia itani China itani kuma chika tani kuzikola basi anthu awiri akumenya awiri wanda China ndi USA ndiye kumbuyo kwa USA kuli anthu kuli maiko kumbuyo kwa China kuli maiko kumbuyo kwa USA wa mkulu aliko ndi UK kumbuyo kwa China wa mkulu aliko ndi Russia ndiye kuli maiko ena zikuta kumene tikupita chikuchika ndi chani nthawi yakwana Mulungu afuna atiwike yeye kuti aliko basi palibe amene asitezi palibe amene apoze mavuto amene akubwera kusukula pansi kulibe
Samuel. Kwa nimeona watu kutoka maliko ena kutawa ena kutawa ngono ena kutawa ndani ena kutawa mavuto kusoka kwa mwela kwa maawi ndiye maona za maawi ya kutawa ndio kwa maawi kutawa ya maliko ena ndiye maona chonto zikuchitika chonto kini mampu Samuel ndichani zikuchitika ya amati aba America kandi ndani kandi the nations akaura azwa chipanda alama akwabela watu akwana miza watu apika matumba ngao akula magari motao sasa niko kutatandiza watu ndiye ni maneno kusoma kutaka kumaya kuintendele akumu mtu akasubira atawia plata aone kutakwenda kutani aona kati kuna kwa skuli binogora kwa vile sawa kwa kuti kuna skuli binogora ndiye ni maona mafuku posa tera pompa leo na mafuku akutawa ndiye ndaona ma president mimi itabarika akusoma kana akuti ni mungu kumele kutapite. America ngati mukumbukira 2019 Mungu anafotokoza 2020 Mungu anafotokoza 2021 Mungu anafotokoza America, China, Russia ndi UK ku Europe tipitire kupemphera Mungu alikuisa ntchito maonena kuti sikhala so yonena kuti njoku zikamamenyana wakutika ndi chani ayi sizikhala so choncho mwina pano lero sopano mkwizi wamene yafikira ndiye ikuchitika ngoina ili yose ndiye Mungu anakamba za China ndi Russia kuti akhala akulowa ndiye America utafufuza demokrasi yako 2019 utafufuza demokrasi yako ifaili ndikavuto kena awa abwera ndina yake yangati yabwino azipeleka ndrama okanga kuti zopanda malamulo koma vuto demokrasi zioneka ngati liko kubeka kulibe pakhankhanza ndiye ma president wena akonda chiti kwafika takulowa maiko alandidwa aja pano kwa na 3 asikala alanda aja kwalandidwa Russia kuda panopo maiko apa akuntunda akumakana kumene kuja kunali asikali ya France akwakana autanya mukazipita amene atandire ndi acha Russia ndiye ku Ukraine mkiona imene iliko ndiye mukapite ku Taiwan mkangane zida mazi za China America ndiye mastima yena kupita ku Ukraine ndege zinazokusisa katundu zida mpungwe wa ukulu kwa mbilioni na kuti wa ukulu ili ni chuma chigwedera ndewe yosanambike chuma chigwedera tipemphere kuti pasachitike kanthu.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin is calling this a, quote, special military operation to protect Donbass. It is clearly bigger than that. Now, he made a surprise appearance on state television calling for the demilitarization of Ukraine, blaming the government in Kyiv for bloodshed, but said Russian forces are not planning an occupation.
Whoever tries to interfere with us, and even more so to create threats for our country, our people should know that Russia's response will be immediate and will lead you to such consequences that you have never experienced in your history.
Now, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, he went on Facebook again to address the nation. He says he's imposing martial law but urged the country not to panic.
Today, each of you should stay calm. Stay at home if you can. We are working. The Army is working. The whole sector of defense and security is working. No panic. We are strong. We are ready for everything. We will win over everybody because we are Ukraine.
Jim, you are there this morning witnessing generations of post-World War II order upended.
John, that's right. We wake up this morning to a war in Europe, a deadly one already. Take a moment to consider that. And it unfolded, it began to unfold last night in what you might call a worst-case scenario. U.S. intelligence assessments for weeks had been saying that Russia was preparing for a broad-scale invasion of this country, beginning with an air campaign and a missile campaign and an artillery campaign. That's exactly what we saw, quickly followed by ground forces. The first targets hit with cruise and ballistic missiles in Kyiv, the capital, in and around Kyiv, the capital, in Mariupol in the south, and in the northeast of the country in Kharkiv, hit by artillery barrages. And very quickly after that, that effort to, in effect, soften the battlefield as well as strike military targets to attempt to disable the Ukrainian military. Just one other thing I want to mention that the NATO Secretary General spoke about. He reiterated that NATO has no intention of committing its own forces, its own troops, to fight Russia in Ukraine. It remains a military support operation, if you want to call it that, supplying lethal assistance to the Ukrainian military, and he spoke of continuing that, but no NATO troops on the front line. That said, Russian forces and NATO forces are now in very close proximity. More NATO forces have been moved closer to that eastern frontier, close enough that the NATO Secretary General highlighted that deconfliction communication continues. That is, that's deliberate communication between NATO and the Russian side to make sure that their planes in the air, the ships on the seas, their ground forces don't get too close to each other, don't misinterpret moves as attacks or acts of war. That, John and Brianna, just highlights the diciness, if you want to call it that, the danger of how when you have this much going on, the danger of escalation is real.
In the capital, Kiev, here's our international correspondent, Oleg Garin.
The rush to Kyiv, a capital under attack. As we headed for the city this morning, there was little moving, apart from Ukrainian troops. But the Russians are watching from the skies, ready to strike, as they did here, just an hour outside the capital. This is an air defense missile system. It was hit yesterday. The smoke is still rising here. And here too, after an early morning strike on a block of flats near Kyiv's Giuliani airport. The authorities here say it was a Russian missile strike that killed 2 people. It could have been many more, but plenty of locals had fled or taken cover in shelters.
Following a telephone conversation President Biden held with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and in alignment with the decision by our European allies, the United States will join them in sanctioning President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov and members of the Russian National Security Team. Well, it has been under consideration and on the table for some time, as you know, and as I just conveyed, the President's strong view and strong principle from the beginning of this conflict, and even before, I should say, has been to take actions and steps in alignment with our European partners, and this is certainly evidence of that. Certainly the this step that we are doing in alignment and in coordination with the Europeans just sends a clear message about the strength of the opposition to the actions by President Putin and the direction in his leadership of the Russian military. You know, I would say our message to the Ukrainian people continues to be that we stand with you, we support you, we are going to do everything, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, continue to provide security assistance, and rally the world to condemn the actions of President Putin.
Only a dozen kilometers from the EU's eastern border, the Russian army is committing barbaric actions during its invasion of Ukraine. It is bombing and launching missiles, killing innocent people. At the same time, the entire world is witnessing the determined and brave resistance by the Ukrainian army and population. As Russian forces unleash their assault on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, we are resolved to continue imposing massive costs on Russia, costs that will further isolate Russia from the international financial system and our economies. in coordination with President Biden, President Macron, Bundeskanzler Scholz and Prime Minister Draghi, as well as Prime Minister Trudeau and Prime Minister Johnson, we considered a significant tightening of our international response. The European Union and its partners are working to cripple Putin's ability to finance his war machine. I will now propose to EU leaders the following measures. First, we commit to ensuring that a certain number of Russian banks are removed from SWIFT. This will ensure that these banks are disconnected from the international financial system and harm their ability to operate globally. SWIFT is the world's dominant global interbank payment system. Cutting banks off will stop them from conducting most of their financial transactions worldwide and effectively block Russian exports and imports. Second, we will stop Putin from using his war chest. We will paralyze the assets of Russia's central bank. This will freeze its transactions, and it made it impossible for the central bank to liquidate assets. And finally, we will work to prohibit Russian oligarchs from using their financial assets on our markets. All of these measures will significantly harm Putin's ability to finance his war. And they will have an eroding, severely eroding impact on his economy. Putin embarked on a path aiming to destroy Ukraine. But what he's also doing, in fact, is destroying the future of his own country.
The initial phase of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia's military is underway. Thanks for joining us. I'm Cheryl Miller, along with Julie Bragg and Candace Burns. President Biden has announced tough new sanctions against Russia in response to that attack. CBS 6's Bill Fitzgerald has been monitoring the situation overseas and joins us now with the very latest. Bill?
Cheryl, the invasion began last night, that is early morning Ukraine time, and since then, Russian military forces have advanced even further into Ukraine. Take a look. This is some new video we're seeing out of Ukraine. It follows the bombing of an apartment building. From the outside, you see parts of the structure have been destroyed, balconies in pieces. This video from inside one of the homes also shows more damage. You see civilians caught in the crossfire, glass shattered all over the floor, what looks like wires hanging down from outside windows. In another part of Ukraine, people took shelter from bombing in the train stations. They're not waiting for trains, they're sheltering there. The Pentagon says Russia fired roughly 100 missiles in this initial phase of the attack, targeting Ukraine's military infrastructure and the highly populated residential areas. That's a problem for all those folks. Since then, Russia has taken control of the Chernobyl nuclear plant. That is according to Ukrainian officials. After meetings with his national security team and other G7 world leaders, President Biden unveiled what he describes as unprecedented sanctions against Russia.
We've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets. We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself, cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen.
Meanwhile, NATO says it will activate defense plans to protect its eastern flank. A group of American F-35s has been deployed from Germany to the Baltic region in support. President Biden says he will not send American forces into Ukraine, though the U.S. has sent lethal aid. Ukrainian officials say they will fight to defend their homeland, and they do not expect anyone else to fight alongside them, but they do want support.
Well, crude oil has surged above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014 because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Analysts are concerned that a war could disrupt global energy supplies. Oil prices have surged more than $20 a barrel since the start of the new year on fears of sanctions on Russia's energy sector. Russia is the world's second largest producer of oil.
Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, overnight, the rolling thunder of multiple missile strikes. Vladimir Putin wants to destroy Ukraine's identity. In reality, he's promoting it. Russian troops on foot in Kharkiv using armored vehicles for cover. And here's why. Ukrainian ground forces, they pretty much only have ground forces, engaging Russians with rocket-propelled grenades and a machine gun.
African leaders are meeting their European colleagues in Brussels in Belgium. The EU is Africa's largest trading partner, according to UN data, but Africa's trade with China is growing.
There is a concern, if you will, in EU, not just EU, but I think even in the US and others, that African countries are drifting slowly towards the east, particularly in trade.
Here in Kenya's capital, Nairobi, China's growing presence can't be missed. In the 1990s, this main road through the city was built by a German company. A new highway is now being built in its place by Chinese contractors funded by a Chinese loan. It was more than a century ago that European powers scrambled to colonize most of Africa. Here in Kenya, British colonialists built this as an administrative centre in 1913. But things have changed. It's now an art gallery and it's dwarfed by the new Chinese-built highway. And China is just one of the world powers who are today vying for influence and for Africa's resources. Russia held its first summit for Africa 3 years ago. President Vladimir Putin promised aid and trade deals without the conditions often demanded by the West. Between meetings, delegates were wooed with weapons at an arms fair. Russia's military presence in Africa is growing, as are its arms exports to the continent. So the EU wants the world to know it's still a major player. But economists say its terms of trade with Africa are unfair, profiting from cheap African raw materials.
One of the most watched sporting events in the world, the Champions League, is planned to take place in St. Petersburg, Russia, in a few months' time. This May, in fact. It's the biggest club trophy in football, watched by hundreds of millions around the world, as you'd expect. It's a huge PR coup for Putin to have secured it. But now, European football's governing body, UEFA, is considering moving the venue elsewhere. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, has called on English clubs to boycott the Champions League final amid the Ukraine crisis. Boris Johnson even backed calls for the game to be taken away from Russia yesterday in Parliament. We can see that here.
That he is going to end up with a Russia that is poorer as a result of the sanctions that the world will implement. A Russia that is more isolated. A Russia that has pariah status, Mr. Speaker. No chance of holding football tournaments in a Russia that invades sovereign countries, Mr. Speaker.
Ada McGee, it's not going to happen, is it?
Of course, one question many are wondering is how this conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the related sanctions may affect the economy here in the United States. Crown Force Dan Kerman has been speaking with financial experts about that. He joins us live with details. Dan.
Well, still plenty of uncertainty in terms of how long this will last and where it's going to go, but some of those impacts we're already starting to see. If it seems like you've been paying more at the pump lately, you have, and much of that is tied to concerns over the Russian-Ukraine conflict.
Russia is a supplier of both natural gas and also oil, and actually oil is one of their main sources of revenue. So if they're not able to find buyers, I mean, essentially, there's going to be less oil available on the global markets. And so if there's less oil, there's less gas, and if there's less gas, the price goes up.
We begin tonight with the latest in Ukraine, where diplomatic talks are in the works following Russian President Vladimir Putin's order to have nuclear forces on high alert. While fighting continues in various parts of Ukraine, allies like Canada and members of the European Union slapped on more sanctions. Jason Idola has the details.
More destruction is left behind in places like Kharkiv and Donetsk, as Russian troops are reportedly closing in the country's interior, including its capital.
We hope this night will be quiet. We hope the Russians take the decision, move back to Russia. There ain't nothing to find here in our home.
More explosions lit up the sky in Kyiv overnight, and both sides are reporting deaths on the ground. Escalated tensions led to a call for nuclear forces by Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Top officials in leading NATO countries have allowed themselves to make aggressive comments about our country. Therefore, I hereby order the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff to place the Russian Army Deterrence Force on combat alert.
The order was followed by Ukraine announcing a delegation will meet with Russian officials at the Belarus border for talks.
The only thing there is to negotiate is an armistice, right? Everybody stops shooting and everybody stays where they are, right? Nobody else needs to die. I think that's going to be the only thing that's on the table here.
In an attempt to seek refuge, thousands continue to flee Ukraine by vehicle and train and are met with major delays at borders.
So far, at least 300,000 Ukrainians has entered into the EU territory.
While many try to escape, protests continue to grow across the globe in support of Ukraine and its people, including this one at a Russian embassy in Berlin. And more sanctions on Russia's economy were rolled out. Canada's transport minister says Russian planes are now banned from Canadian airspace.
I would now look at the corporate aircraft that come into Canada that may be not registered in Russia but owned by Russian oligarchs. And I would suggest that perhaps those airplanes should be forbidden from flying in Canadian airspace as well.